easiest area to patent because they've patented parts of the human genome, but not necessarily the cause of the bother. So this is beginning at the research in academia and at the research, sharp end of research. This is beginning to be acknowledged. And it's actually going to be incredibly important because the failure of current treatments, no treatment currently has been shown to work. So my reference that I've given you here is critical because at long last, they're beginning to question the amyloid hypothesis, which has been what everything has been based on to date for most neurodegenerative diseases. So it's minimally genetic. It's certainly not an amyloid issue. That is the end of a long, long process. And although they're called neurodegenerative diseases, I would actually call them endocrine diseases because they start in the gut. Now, the moment conventional medicine starts admitting that, it's a huge political upset. The neurologists will fight the endocrinologists, etc., etc. So this is cutting edge, and it takes about 30 years for cutting edge research to filter down into clinical practice. Sadly, but true. Now, when we look at the origin of all these diseases, they're extraordinarily uniform. Although they have different names, they're diagnosed via brain imagery with particular aspects being shown to be different from A, B, or C. They actually are incredibly common. It's only the N bit, which is really a bit late in the day, that you see the differences. Now, some people have been starting to describe neurodegenerative diseases as protein cancers because they know it's not, oh, you've got amyloid deposits. Another way is identifying proteins that mediate cell death in neurodegeneration, in other words, in the nerves and in the brain. But that's really looking at the end of a process again. They're seeing what the biochemical mechanisms are, the cellular mechanisms, which create the situation. And yes, they're absolutely right, these are all involved, but let's go back to where it starts. Viral and bacterial implications in every single neurodegenerative disease. That's where it starts. I may also say a significant amount of cancer starts in the gut, even though it may not be labeled colon cancer. For example, at least 20% of prostate cancer is due to bacterial causes. Breast is much the same, and so on. So we are actually looking at bacteria and viruses. Now, there's a lady here called Kay, and I apologize if I'm spelling her name wrong, but Kay Ferreira and somebody called Christian Murphy, who've done some phenomenal research in the last 10 years. And we are totally indebted by what they are able to prove. Now, proving is important because nobody believes you in our pseudoscience world unless it's right, unless you can prove it in a scientific context. Now, interestingly enough, when I was training, and there is a very eminent professor, Professor Kerry Bone, based in Australia, who kept saying to us, these diseases start in the gut. Now, when I trained, there wasn't this evidence available. He found that out in the 1980s. He's a very eminent biochemist. He is also a medical herbalist. And he says, go to the gut every time. I may say he's beloved by his patients and has achieved phenomenal results, but more than that, what he has put into the public domain, at least in Europe, not so much in Canada because they're blocking us, but in Europe, he has put so much into that public domain and in Australia to enable phytotherapy or medical herbalism to be available for the man in the street. It is not confined just to the few. So here we have Ms. Berra's work showing that MS starts in the gut. The bacteria demyelinate the nerves in the gut through which an antibody process is set up, circles in blood plasma and reaches the brain because, of course, blood circulates. They are able to go through the blood-brain barrier. And start their damage. But that's very late in the day. It starts 10, 20 years earlier in the gut. And she has replicated this in mice. And mice are used because they're very close to us as human beings, as being a way to show this is either a way to go therapeutically or for evidence for scientific purposes. Chlamydium pneumoniae is another pathogen, also implicated in MS, but not always. Now, chlamydia is not, as many think, a sexually transmitted disease. It's a genus of bacteria. And you might have an infection of the eye, which is chlamydia. Doesn't mean to say you have been rather rash in your sexual partners. It's nothing to do with that. It's a genus of bacteria, but it causes an awful lot of problems. And again, we come back to that very old war horse, the herpes virus, right? Which is a group of viruses which include things like chickenpox, and in its most virulent form, in the sense of a virus we can deal with, Epstein-Barr. Now, Epstein-Barr is a nasty piece of work because it doesn't appear to hit us very badly, but it lives with us forever and is capable of developing to really nasty stuff like Kaposi's sarcoma and so on and so forth. And interestingly enough, in my practice, I have a very large number of MS patients who have had Epstein-Barr. Now, one of the little things that Epstein-Barr does, it permanently alters the shape of your red blood cell. That means your delivery system of nutrients throughout your body is going to be impaired. Nothing you can't fix by other means, but it immediately puts you on the back foot when you've got a serious disease to deal with. So you have to realize that and account for it therapeutically. But there is no question that Epstein-Barr is a nasty piece of work, and it is part of that herpes group of viruses. Now, some other common factors. These diseases tend to hit more women than men, Parkinson's being the one where it's reversed. They nearly all have, or the sufferers nearly always have depression on and off. That's associated. And again, from my point of view, I can relate to this totally because most of my patients who have these neurodegenerative disorders have depression. And very often I trace back the cause or the possible start of the neurodegenerative disease to an emotional event and an infection, whether bacterial or viral. Two seem to go together. Now, when we're talking about emotions, we're talking about brain chemistry, serotonin versus dopamine, etc. Now, the 5-HTTP axons, which mediate depression, actually can travel via nerve axons. So here you are, you have another bits of the parcel or jigsaw. You can see why the two are in association. So when I treat these diseases, this is an aspect that is fundamental. Because if you don't balance your serotonin and dopamine, you need to travel down the line. So they all have this in common: more women than men, depression, and poor diet. Unfortunately, in the Western world, we have, generally speaking, and I don't attach this to any individual, but by and large, the diet is extremely poor in relation to our body physiology. The over-processed, over-produced foods that are available actually are killing us. It's as simple as that. We need to go back to eating less, we need to go back to eating better quality, and we need to go back to simpler foods, because the processing and the various changes that occur in food, the additives, actually are bad, actively bad for our bodies. Now, we can't control our body because that's what you're born with. So those reactions, the mechanism of the body is there. What we do too often is abuse it from day one. The other aspect or common factor with all these diseases is lifestyle. Stress, lack of exercise, lifestyle issues. So these are actually more likely to be the cause is in your lifestyle, and that includes, of course, poor diet. Even more common factors, it affects an older population rather than a younger population, exceptions everywhere. And the reason for that is because the bacteria and the viruses evolved take time to do their deadly work before they're diagnosable. Previously, these diseases were confined to the Western world, no longer. And this is where the direct relationship to foodstuffs and overprocessing of foods and inappropriate foods is showing up. Because the new BRIC countries, which is Brazil, India, China, Korea, and Russia, we have an exponential increase in these diseases. And their dietary intake and lifestyle has changed dramatically since about the 1970s. I mean, China is now the world's superpower. India is close behind. That huge explosion of the shifting of wealth has brought in a desire to ape the Western world. Well, to be quite honest, I hope wiser heads prevail and they don't ape the Western world, because if they do, they're going to get the nasty diseases we have to deal with. It's a direct cause and effect. Now, all that we've talked about before, all the bad stuff like the diet, lack of exercise, the old effect, this leads to a dysregulation of the hypothalamic axis. In other words, the hypothalamus in your brain isn't working properly. Now that's another thing all these diseases have in common. And if the HPA isn't working properly, your thyroid ain't working properly. All these diseases involved a period of prolonged inflammation. In other words, inflammation is the body's mechanism with dealing with potential pathogens. If it continues for a very long time, the body is unable to cope, so it weakens. So from a bacterial point of view, it's a great strategy. I'm just going to keep hammering. I'm just going to keep hammering because I'm going to win this one. Because the body cannot keep a high level of inflammation going for very long periods of time, like 30 to 40 years. So the sheer amount of stuff that all these diseases in common is now in part being validated by scientific observation validation of the mechanisms of neurodegeneration which are shared by these diseases which have different labels.